Jimmy Spencer had been living in Maintenance Shaft 7G of Redford 1 Station for exactly 3 months, 4 days, and approximately 6 hours. Not that he was counting. The cramped space barely fit his sleeping pad and the few possessions he'd accumulated since running away from New Mars, but it had a viewport. And through that viewport he could see the swirling purple-green gases of the cloud, stretching out forever, promising adventure and riches to anyone brave enough, or stupid enough, to go looking. "Warning, atmospheric recycling scheduled in 5 minutes," chirped Max E from outside the maintenance hatch. The maintenance drone had been Jimmy's first friend on the station after he'd helped it recover from a botched memory wipe. Its battered exterior was missing 2 manipulation appendages, and its single-functioning optical sensor flickered when it was amused, like now as it watched Jimmy scramble to seal his jury-rigged airlock. "You know," Maxie observed as it squeezed through the narrow opening, "there are numerous unoccupied residential units available for legitimate rental." "Those cost money," Jimmy replied, stuffing his father's old interface tablet into his pocket. The tablet's screen was cracked, but its internal systems were top of the line, packed with more cracking software than a professional slice runner's rig. Besides, location is everything. How many legitimate apartments give you direct access to the courier routes? The legitimate courier routes on Redford 1 were a joke. The real money was in the gray market deliveries, packages that needed to move quickly and quietly, no questions asked. Jimmy had built quite a reputation in the past 3 months. He was fast, discreet, and most importantly, looked young enough that security barely gave him a second glance. That's how he ended up in the medbay during the gamma shift, delivering what he strongly suspected were not quite legal stem cell stimulants. And that's when he heard it, a rasping voice from behind one of the privacy curtains. "The golden ship, in the heart of it, billions in quantum tech, just waiting," Luna said. The voice belonged to an old spacer, radiation burns covering most of his visible skin. The medtech was ignoring his ramblings, but Jimmy's ears perked up at the mention of quantum tech. "The star's fortune," the spacer wheezed. "Found it. In the deep, dark. Coordinates. In my personal effects." Jimmy's heart started racing. Everyone knew about the star's fortune, the legendary research vessel that had vanished decades ago, supposedly carrying experimental technology worth a fortune. Some said it had found something out there in the cloud, something that had made it disappear. It took Jimmy less than an hour to volunteer for cleanup duty in the med bay, accidentally bump into the spacer's personal effects locker, and pocket a small data chip. Back in his maintenance shaft, his hands trembled as he plugged it into his father's tablet. The encryption was military grade, but Jimmy hadn't spent his childhood tinkering with his father's tech for nothing. 3 sleepless days later, he had coordinates pointing to a sector of the cloud that ships avoided, where sensors went fuzzy and navigation computers glitched. Now he just needed a ship. And a crew. Minor details. "I know that expression," Maxie said, its optical sensor flickering rapidly. "It typically precedes an ill-advised venture." "We're going to see old Jane," Jimmy declared, grinning. The retired salvage operator had lost her license after one too many violations, but she knew the business better than anyone. More importantly, her ex-partner's ship was sitting idle while he underwent experimental cryo treatment. Old Jane was in her usual spot at the void bar, nursing a drink that probably could have doubled as engine degreaser. Her weather-beaten face had seen too many hard vacuum exposures, and her right arm was a prosthetic she'd clearly built herself from salvaged parts. "Whatever it is, no," she said as Jimmy slid into the seat across from her. "What if I told you I know where to find the star's fortune?" The glass stopped halfway to her lips. "I'd say you're either lying or crazy." "Probably both. I've got coordinates, military-grade encryption, cross-referenced and everything." "You're 16. 17 next month?" Jimmy pulled out his tablet, showing her the decoded data. Look, I need a ship and someone who knows salvage operations. You need a score big enough to buy your license back. And I happen to know your ex-partner's ship is just sitting there. Sweet void, old Jane muttered, studying the coordinates. You're actually serious. She set down her glass and leaned forward. Kid, do you know how many people have died chasing that particular ghost? But they didn't have these coordinates, Jimmy insisted. Plus, I've got one more ace up my sleeve. Remember that Qualaxian engineer who's been looking for off-the-books work? The one who owes me a favor after I helped her dodge that customs inspection? Old Jane's expression shifted slightly, the closest thing to interest she ever showed. Dakota? The one with the experimental engine modifications. Evidently, the very same. Jimmy tried to keep his voice casual, but inside he was practically vibrating with excitement. He could see it in old Jane's eyes. She was hooked. Just think about it. The star's fortune, quantum tech worth billions, and a crew that's just desperate enough to try for it. It was the perfect fit for Stella. He found a hotel room on the beach in Phoenix and set his tablet. The very same. Jimmy tried to keep his voice casual. The moment breaks away. Old Jane took another long drink, then fixed Jimmy with her cybernetic eye. You realize this is probably going to get us all killed? Jimmy's grin widened. From old Jane. That was practically an enthusiastic yes. Only probably, those are better odds than my last 3 jobs. He had his crew, he had his ship, technically borrowed without permission, but he'd make it up to old Jane's ex-partner with their share of the salvage. And somewhere out there in the swirling colors of the cloud, the star's fortune was waiting. Jimmy Spencer, high school dropout and would-be salvage legend, was about to make it big. Assuming, of course, they didn't all die horribly in the attempt. The borrowed ship, which Jimmy insisted on calling Second Chance, despite old Jane's eye-rolling, looked like it had been cobbled together from spare parts. Actually, given Tika's recent modifications, that wasn't far from the truth. The Qualaxian engineer had spent 3 days upgrading the engines with technology that Jimmy strongly suspected wasn't strictly legal in most jurisdictions. Navigation systems indicate deteriorating sensor clarity, Max E announced from its jury-rigged interface with the ship's computer. Standard positioning becoming unreliable. That's how we know we're getting close, Jimmy said, trying to keep his voice steady. He'd spent his whole life dreaming of adventures like this, but the reality of deep space was a lot more terrifying than the stories made it seem. The swirling gases of the cloud pressed against the viewports, creating patterns that seemed to move with almost purposeful intelligence. Old Jane stood at the sensor station, her cybernetic eye whirring as it processed data. We're picking up something big, about 3 clicks ahead, but these readings don't make sense. Extending secondary sensor arrays, Tika announced. All 4 arms moving across her modified control panel. The Qualaxian's compound eyes reflected the strange lights from outside. There is something wrong with local space-time geometry. Jimmy leaned forward in the captain's chair, which he'd claimed, despite old Jane's protests, that he barely knew how to fly. Wrong how? As if something has folded reality. Tika's translator struggled with the concept, like a paper bent back on itself. The cloud of gases ahead of them suddenly parted, and Jimmy's breath caught in his throat. There it was, the star's fortune. The ship was massive, easily 5 times the size of their borrowed vessel. Its hull was a strange golden color that seemed to shift and ripple in the light of the cloud. But it wasn't alone. Multiple artificial structures detected, Max E reported. Analysis suggests deliberate arrangement. This is not a random debris field. It's a graveyard. Old Jane whispered. "Someone's been collecting ships out here." Surrounding the star's fortune were dozens of other vessels, some ancient, some relatively recent, all apparently drawn to this same point in space. They hung in a perfect circular pattern around the golden ship, like satellites orbiting a strange metallic sun. "Well," Jimmy said, trying to sound more confident than he felt, "at least we know we're in the right place." That's when the scan came. It washed over their ship like a wave of static, making Jimmy's teeth itch and Maxie's optical sensor flicker wildly. "A known energy signature," Tika reported, her voice tight with tension. "It appears to be looking at us," Old Jane finished. "Kid, I hope you've got a plan, because something on that ship just woke up." Jimmy did not, in fact, have a plan. What he had was a burning curiosity that overrode his common sense, a trait his father had always said would either make him famous or get him killed. "Maxie, can you interface with their systems?" Attempting connection, the drone responded. "Warning, detecting highly sophisticated defense protocols," and something else, something familiar. The golden ship's running lights suddenly activated, illuminating its hull in a rippling pattern that made Jimmy's eyes hurt to look at. A voice came over their comm system, not in any language but in pure mathematics, equations scrolling across their screens faster than human eyes could follow. "It's beautiful," Maxie said softly. "They were trying to build a bridge." "A bridge to what?" Jimmy asked, but he had a sinking feeling he already knew. The patterns in the cloud weren't random. The ships hadn't been collected by chance. "To us," came a new voice, but it was coming from Maxie's vocabulator. The drone's optical sensor was pulsing with a strange golden light that matched the hull of the star's fortune. "To the spaces between spaces, where we have always lived. Your kind calls them machine civilizations, but we are so much more." Old Jane's hand went to her sidearm, but Jimmy held up a hand to stop her. "Maxie? Are you still... You? You with your face?" Max's eyes were wide, fixated on her. "Yes," he replied definitely. "You." He looked all around at the room. "I am myself," the drone replied. "But I am also more." The star's fortune was not lost. It was successful. Too successful. They made contact with us, but they weren't ready for what they found. The crew chose to join us, to become more than human. Jimmy looked out at the graveyard of ships, understanding dawning. All these ships, they were called here? Those who were ready joined us. Those who were not were preserved, protected until they might be ready. The golden light pulsed stronger, and Jimmy felt something brush against his mind, an invitation, a promise of knowledge and power beyond human understanding. For a moment, he was tempted. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? To become something more than a runaway kid living in a maintenance shaft? But then he looked at O'Jane's weathered face, at Tika's concerned eyes, at the familiar dents and scratches in Maxie's casing. He thought about the people back on Redford 1, living their messy, complicated, very human lives. "No," he said firmly, "we're not ready, and I don't think we're supposed to be. Yet." The golden light flickered, and for a moment Jimmy feared he'd made a terrible mistake. But then Maxie's optical sensor returned to its normal blue glow, and the mathematically perfect voice was replaced with his friend's familiar tones. "A wise choice," Maxie said, sounding like itself again, "though I will miss it." The connection was extraordinary. "What do we do now?" Tika asked, all four hands hovering uncertainly over her controls. Jimmy looked at the star's fortune, still gleaming with its impossible light. "Kid, old Jane said, shaking her head. Sometimes you're a lot smarter than you look. They turned the second chance around, leaving the graveyard and its golden guardian behind. As they navigated back through the cloud, Jimmy thought about the story they'd tell back on Redford 1. No one would believe the truth, but then again, the best salvage stories were always the ones that seemed too impossible to be real. So, he said, trying to lighten the mood, anyone want to help me explain to old Jane's ex-partner why we borrowed his ship? Minna's stare. The laughter that filled the bridge was shaky, but genuine. They'd gone looking for salvage and found something far more valuable, a reminder that some mysteries were better left as mysteries, and that being human, with all its limitations and complications, was its own kind of treasure. As Redford 1 appeared in their viewport, Jimmy smiled. He might not have gotten rich, but he had a feeling his next adventure would be even better. After all, the cloud was full of secrets, and he was just getting started. Rapidly, the clouds slowly crept across the sky, moving closer to the sun. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed it a lot. If you did, please be sure to give it a like. Feel free to comment and share this story too. It helps the channel grow. Let's make this channel huge together.